Let's start with Nigel Farage, and I think best expressed on the front cover of the Metro. The end of the world is Nige, they say. Just let's have a listen to what Keir Starmer had to say about Nigel Farage yesterday.
That's the question you have to ask about Nigel Farage. Can you trust him? Can you trust him with your future? He set out economic plans that contain billions upon billions of completely unfunded spending. Precisely the sort of irresponsible splurge that sent your mortgage cost, your bills and the cost of living through the roof. It's Liz Truss all over again.
Is there a general election in a few weeks? I mean, we're four years away from one.
I think the thing is, and both of us will probably agree on this, it was really quite cringe. Not only was he sort of doing this campaign thing, but it's like he doesn't actually understand how he's got to attack or manoeuvre around Nigel Farage, who is going to be this huge political threat for him. But it just didn't... It felt like a completely overdone intervention on the part of the Prime Minister, who you would expect had other more important pressing matters to deal with than kind of have a spat with Nigel.
Well, let's get to the point. I mean, the reason he's doing this is because he's not worried about the Conservative Party. He believes, probably correctly looking at the numbers, that the biggest threat to Labour winning the next general election and in local elections is reform.
Yeah,
it's changed the political landscape.
But he's got two problems. In the same way that the Conservatives did at the last election, is that you expand out for the people that are voting for you that much that you're trying to please lots of different groups, which you can't. And eventually what happens is you get other parties that come in, like Reform, like the Greens on the left side and the Lib Dems, who then start sort of curtailing your voter base. The issue here isn't necessarily Labour versus Conservative or, you know, who's going to come out on top of that. The issue is mainstream parties and the fact that they've lost the trust of most people because they're sick of it just pendulum swinging from one crisis to another with a different colour.
The thing is, Ava, you know, there was a moment where we were actually starting to, as you were saying before you came on, like, scrutinise what it is that Nigel Farage is suggesting, you know, sort of lifting of the two-child benefit cap, restoring all these different cuts back and how on earth that is going to be costed. But then, of course, you get this sort of what appeared to be a sort of slightly hastily arranged trip up to a glassworks factory for Keir Starmer to make this sort of, you know, rallying cry, don't trust this man. And you get this sort of, what is, you have to admit, a rather brilliant retort from Nigel Farage. And in the post he said, why are you so obsessed with me, Keir Starmer? You know, with a little, you know, the nail varnish, sort of like, I'm so pretty, why are you looking at me all the time? You know, Ava, this is the problem, isn't it? That he's now... We're now talking about the reaction, right, rather than the actual numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally bizarre that a Prime Minister with 400 MPs who's not sitting an election for another 4 years would fight a man with only 5 MPs. You know, the country is asking Keir Starmer to, you know, go back and, you know, perhaps fix it. A lot of us are living paycheck to paycheck and, you know, that we're struggling with the economy at the moment. They'd like to see him in the office, actually maybe doing a bit of work on that. And instead he's giving this speech, you know,
why is it surprising? I mean, it's an important thing. Coming back to what Keir Starmer says, when he's talking about the Conservative Party, he says that they're sliding into the abyss. That's what he says. It's the end of the Conservative Party.
They've gone. No one's listening to Kemi Badenoch at the moment. You know, I mean, I wouldn't even look toward her. I hardly even listen to her during Prime Minister's questions, to be honest. I'm listening to what the other backbenchers are saying from Reform. You know, at the next election, it is going to be between Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage. And, you know, if the Conservatives don't find someone better, they're going to...
But then in which case it does make sense as to why Keir Starmer is coming out on the front foot trying to, you know, dismantle Nigel Farage's offer at this very early stage.
The thing is, he's not trying to dismantle Nigel Farage's offer. What he's doing is playing into the Reform's hands in terms of, you know, seeing them as the official opposition.
So who's advising Keir Starmer to go and do this, then?
Well, I mean, there are political advisors there, but, I mean, maybe you know a little bit more than I do about what's going on behind the scenes.
I'm starting to think that his key advisor, his chief of staff, might be an op, because it doesn't quite make sense what he's making him do at the moment.
Yeah, I don't know what it is.
An operative. I think he might might be trying to bring him down from the inside, because some of these decisions that they're making recently don't make any sense.
Well, like Dominic Cummings, you mean?
Yeah.
But to help us out, why do you think the Conservative Party aren't having an impact? When it comes to reform, they can say what they like. I mean, the Institute of Fiscal Studies said that the party's pledges this reform to increase the income tax personal allowance to £20,000 a year could cost between 50 and 80 billion pounds. It's an interesting thing. It's sort of like the politics, I think, as once described a few days ago as vibes. In other words, people are voting for reform not because they're necessarily attracted to the policies. We don't know what they are. There's another reason for it. Well, help us understand what you think that is.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I think one of the problems with... Let's take the Conservative Party as the example, because you're right, they are not tracking well in the polls. You know, this once kind of powerful entity in British politics is greatly diminished. And I think there are a lot of people who just don't want to hear from Conservatives right now, and they're failing to gain traction. And they've got this new person, you know, the clue is in the name, Reform, who wants to change stuff. And they seem a lot more credible because they don't have the same kind of history as the mainstream political parties, who've got records, both good and bad, largely bad, from the last election, to stand on.
It's that conversation about why people want to move away from mainstream parties. You know, it's the same impulsive reaction of why Donald Trump was successful too. Just help us understand that. This is a radical shift in British politics, and a lot of Reform voters are very upset and uncomfortable about being spoken down to and being, frankly, spoken badly of as well.
Well, people are poor, and Nigel Farage is... Well, he's making the correct diagnosis of some of the problems that people are experiencing at the moment. Perhaps some of the solutions might feel a little pie in the sky at the moment, but then if you look over towards America and you look at what Elon Musk and Donald Trump have done in terms of cuts, it's pretty similar to what Nigel Farage is setting out. You know, a year ago, I think Americans would never have conceived that $150 billion would have been cut from the federal budget and that, you know, US aid would have been completely obliterated. Right. It's pretty much the same playbook that Nigel Farage is working from.
Kemi Badenoch will be pleased, though. She, in a world where she gets very little coverage because what she says doesn't really cut through. Actually, she's on the front of the Daily Mail today. It's an exclusive they're saying, in which she has written about her views, saying that Nigel Farage and Keir Starmer are in a race to the bottom over welfare handouts. And she says in this attack, she says that the pair believed in getting taxpayers to fund unlimited child support for others by scrapping the two-child benefit cap. And she carries on to say that this is unfair, unsustainable, because welfare traps people and drives up costs for everyone. She is, as everybody is, struggling to find water between herself and Reform for her voters. But on this, she has found it.
And that's exactly the point. So there is nobody else on the political spectrum right now that is advocating her view.
Right,
so you've
keeping
got Reform,
the two-child benefit cap.
Keeping the cap. So you've got Reform, who've decided that they can be all things to all people, and Keir Starmer, who sort of flip-flops between certain positions because it was going to be in place, just the same as winter fuel, that they were going to take it away now that it's back.
Right.
So there is some level of at least consistency.
She's found something, hasn't she?
Yeah, clear blue water between her and Reform.
Do you think this is really about policy? You know, I was really interested to listen to what you had to say, Ava. I mean, if you ask most people what political parties believe in, they go to the mainstream political parties. They say, I don't know, they're kind of voting for the best manager. You know, it's all about management consultancy. If you ask people why they vote Reform, they talk to you about British values. And I wonder the extent to which people look at the political parties and think, these people don't believe in anything. The rest, policy, etc., is just window dressing. To what extent do you think that's really what's happening now in British politics, Ava?
Well, I don't know, because I think people have a real identity with voting Labour, or they did before Keir Starmer took office. You know, there was a real sort of trade union push. You felt that you were voting for perhaps socially liberal, you were voting to be a part of a movement that was paying people correctly. None of that has actually come to fruition. But with Reform, you are right. I mean, they do really push British values. It does feel sort of like almost, I guess, a return to old England, and they've really kind of encompassed that sort of feeling very well. The nostalgia,
well, nostalgia. I mean, it's talking about, you know, democracy under the rule of law, etc. They seem, whether it's right or not, to represent a buffet of things that people care about, that they feel increasingly lost or the mainstream political parties are embarrassed to talk about.
But I don't necessarily think that's true, because Conservatives spent a long time talking about British values and talking about belonging. I think it's what you mean by British values, who's included in that and who espouses and who is participating in that. I think those things are important. But ultimately, you're only going to be tested in politics. Like you say, you know, you can't do government by vibes, which a little bit, you know, we're getting from Keir Starmer as well. You have to do stuff that you're going to stick by, that's going to be difficult, that you're not going to be popular for.
Yeah.
Shall we talk about this sort of, I'm going to call it a stunt, but it was a sort of an interesting thing that Robert Jenrick did. So you may have seen it. He went to, I think it was Paddington Station, where he took it upon himself to deal with the issue of fare dodgers. It was actually Stratford, not Paddington. What do we think of this? Ava, what is this about for him? He's obviously somebody who we know would like to, we think, be the leader of the Conservative Party, and so he sort of found a way to make a little, well, moment for himself here.
I was just looking up actually where his constituency was, because he was talking yesterday about how politicians need to get out of Westminster and they need to start focusing on the people again. Yeah, his constituency is not in Stratford. It's actually nowhere near London. I think possibly people would rather him be in the area where he was elected. But do you know what I love about Robert Jenrick? What's so interesting is that just he's talking about fare dodging. He's talking about, you know, fair pay if you're, you know, it's not fair on everyone else if people aren't contributing. Just a short couple of years ago, he was helping out his friend Richard Desmond, who was creating this £1 billion housing project over on the Isle of Dogs in East London. And just before this new piece of legislation got in, Robert Jenrick sneaked through the planning application, which meant that Desmond didn't have to pay £40 million to Tower Hamlets. And look, you know, a couple of pounds here and there with a fare, yeah, it's annoying, but imagine what £40 million could have done to the borough of Tower Hamlets.
He's not wrong about the loss of money. I saw you rolling your eyes when that video went on. Why were you rolling your eyes on?
Because Ravi, you said you wouldn't call it a stunt. I would call it a stunt. And I find the difficulty I have with this is that there are ways that a senior politician could talk about fare dodging or other issues that doesn't resort to this kind of, you know, novelty.
I mean, the fact is, billions of pounds are lost each year,
yeah.
3.8%. It's less than other countries, less than, I think, France and New York. But nevertheless, you know, that's money that's needed for public transport.
Absolutely. But why we should be holding the Mayor of London to account, who
Which
has
I think it was partly what he was
for
pointing out.
Well. But then just sort of, you know, harassing people on the tube. I just think that that's very unbecoming behaviour for somebody who's supposed to be in public life and setting an example.
Well. Although we're in the...
I think it just gave me the ick.
But we are in the age of viral clips. That is how so much of this is done, you know. And you look across the pond, I mean, what happens on Truth Social makes headlines every single day.
I know, but
I think it is the current playbook, isn't it?
Yeah, but I'm a Conservative, and that is both in name and in nature, and just because something's popular, it doesn't mean it's right.
Would you fare dodge? I mean, have you ever done that? I'm just wondering. Don't comment, obviously, without incriminating.
I've definitely been on... You know, when you have the bendy buses, I've definitely been on a bendy bus and not tapped in on occasion.
The point about this is it irritates people. You know, most people are law-abiding citizens that, you know, pay their way. And it actually costs a lot of money. We were talking, for example, about getting to and fro work. And that loss means that it costs more for everybody. Yeah. So he is highlighting something of real importance. The question is, would you stop someone? I mean, if you saw them go through the barrier without paying...
I have stopped someone.
What happened?
So this chap was coming... I was at a tube station, and I knew that this guy was going to try and follow in behind me.
Yeah.
On the gate, and so I tapped my card on the reader, and you know you have like a 3-second gap to be able to get through. So I could feel him come up behind me, and he was going to sort of push past and get through on the same ticket. And so I stopped and I stalled, and he ran back into me, and then fell back, and I went through the barrier.
Good for you, like a rugby tackle in reverse.
Basically, yeah. But I didn't want to get into a fight over it, so I thought I'm not going to win.
I mean, I've
had
it when you're going through with a child. You know, you go through the wider barrier and you've got luggage and stuff, where you tap through and then somebody pushes in front of you and goes through, and then the barrier shuts for you, and then you're like, you can't tap a second time to get through. Yeah. What I always find is that I go through Euston a lot, but the barriers are almost always wide open, presumably because they just don't have the staff to man it. So then it's just open all the time. Then people do tap through, but lots of people don't. If you've bought a ticket, a paper ticket, what are you doing with it?
Yeah.
You know,
and who cut those staff? I think it was Robert Jenrick.
Yeah. It is fascinating. We're going to be talking about that a bit later on, actually.
Yeah, I wonder what you think.
Taking the law into your own hands.
Just to be clear, so people understand the numbers, right? Transport for London lost £130 million last year because of fare dodging. Now, I wonder, do you think people should take the law into their own hands, like Jenrick, and tackle people and tell them, look, you should jolly well pay their way, or other languages available?
I'm going to go with no. I mean, you don't know what that person is going through. You don't know how much they've got in their bank account. What if it is genuinely someone who's going to work and can't afford the fare? I'm very privileged that I can pay for it, so I don't. If they can't, OK, sneak
you'd
through.
support that not just in Transport for London, in shops, that sort of thing, fair enough.
OK, whoa. Yeah, not all the time, but yeah, look, I mean, if someone's struggling, who am I to step in and tell them that they're not allowed to travel?
I mean, I do disagree with that, I'm afraid. I think if you're required to pay the fare, then you should pay the fare. But the issue is that if you're having to take the law into your own hands, there's a much bigger problem if there's a breakdown in law and order that excessively.
Now, talking of taking the law into your own hands, what's going on? There's a story on the front of the Express, I think, where it describes the number of migrants getting in small boats and the number that the French authorities are actually stopping as pathetic. Percentage-wise, I think they're saying that it's less than 40% of migrants who are trying to get into small boats to cross the Channel and illegally get into the UK have been stopped. And the number actually, whilst Yvette Cooper has said we're going to, smash the gangs, we're going to stop the small boats by going and tackling them where they begin rather than trying to tackle them at our border. In fact, the numbers have gone down, the number of illegal migrants being stopped. What's going wrong here? Because we are paying, according to this report in the Express, something like £480,000 a day. What are we getting back for that money?
This has been such a bone of contention about paying the French authorities to be able to think about how they're going to patrol the coast in order to prevent these boats from launching. Look, I think there's a couple of things. One, what are we paying for? Has the Home Office been over to give itself some assurance about, what kind of patrols there are? Is there new technology that we should be using instead of spending this money? Like drone technology, there was an idea there that you could start thinking about how you're going to start watching for people. But ultimately, and this is probably why the government is coming back to the idea of having a deterrent that is about processing people in a third country, so i.e. the Rwanda scheme.
That won't ever come back, though, will it?
But there has been ideas mooted again that actually the only way that you can actually bring the numbers down is that there is a deterrent that even when you come here, actually you're not going to get into the UK, you're going to be processed somewhere else, because this is not something that's going to be easily fixed just by the French. But maybe we should think about paying less.
What do you think about this? Do you think these are open borders? I mean, it's time just to allow people to come. I just wonder what the position is of Politics Joe, in your view. Well,
I mean, we would advocate probably for a processing centre in France. I think that, if you can get a yes or no there, most asylum seekers, I think it's over 80% of them, do actually have their claims accepted when they get to the UK. If you process them before they left Calais or Dunkirk, then then you don't have the issue as well of putting people into hotels. You don't have them making this dangerous crossing across the Channel. I know that we always talk about these push and pull factors, but actually it's been a massive pull factor.
Isn't this what, communities up and down the country are really concerned about? And this is where the great gains of reform are coming from. They want to have this discussion and they don't want to be called racist for having it. The reality is it's close to £500,000 that's spent every day. Over £13,000 crossing the Channel dangerously. You obviously know the numbers of people dying. Now, I understand the point that people wouldn't put their kids on the water unless the water was safe on the land. That's often, the mantra that's trotted out by people who are concerned about this. But people also know that those who are arriving are mostly men of working age.
But that's because men travel first and then they bring their families when they know that it's safe. It's not because they're necessarily economic migrants. You know, I think unless you have safe and legal routes, I'm really not trying to sound like on a moral high ground or anything like that. But if there's no other way to claim asylum in the United Kingdom apart from landing on the shores of the United Kingdom, people are going to make that perilous crossing. And you're right, 500,000 a day to France. I mean, I've been to Calais many times, and you know that is 150 kilometres of border there. All they do is walk up and down with a knife, and then they stab the boats through if they see them. That's all they do. Okay?
And actually, ITN News did an excellent piece not so long ago, just a few weeks ago, actually, where it was shown that actually those migrants who day after day just come back and try again every single day. So if you stop them one day, they will just go back, rest for the night and come back the next day, is that as soon as their feet touch the water, they know that the authorities won't go in after them. You can't check. I mean, I suppose for safety reasons or whatever it might be, the French authorities at the border don't physically get into the water if those migrants are in the water. So they don't go in chasing them, if you see what I mean. So they can stand just at the shore with their feet in the water, and the authorities just have to watch them.
But they don't arrest them. I mean, they're going after the boat. So
the boat,
they just deflate the boat.
Yeah.
That's what you're paying for.
Yeah, but the point is that it's not going to, no matter how much you pay the French, no matter how many patrols, people are motivated to come.
Right.
So that's where the deterrent factor comes in. That's where, yeah, even if you have a processing centre, it's not going to stop people. If they're rejected from that processing claim, it's not going to stop them from attempting it to cross illegally again. And there are safe and legal routes. That's why we have Hong Kongers and Afghans and Ukrainians that are coming in.
That Afghan scheme filled up very quickly and then no one else was allowed in. I think it was like 5,000 a year. I mean, there were many interpreters and people who worked with the British Army who were left to die in
Isn't the deterrent what people are saying
Afghanistan.
out there? It's like, if you come, you're not going to get access to benefits, as simple as that. You're not going to be placed in a hotel.
But that is currently the case. And I think one of the difficulties is that you're putting out this message to say you don't have access to benefits, you don't have access to the NHS, you have to pay a premium if you're coming in as an immigrant. But the people that are coming over are being fed lies by criminal gangs to say that this is what's going to happen when you come to the UK.
Yeah.
And if you don't have access to our information, then you're likely to believe that.
Yeah, and of course, when you know, I've done reports from what was called the jungle at Calais, and of course, we see that it's a French problem because they're there. But to be honest with you, you know, we're speaking to the mayor of Calais, and they're just like, well, I mean, once they leave us, it's your problem. And there is a sort of political toing and froing, isn't there, between France and England?
There's always
about, well, listen, they ultimately want to get to you, it's your problem. It's our problem because this is where they want to get to. They don't want to stay in France for whatever reason. That isn't where they want to stay.
I know, but we did invade Afghanistan, so we could, you know, the French
No,
could
absolutely.
argue
There are reasons
that it is
why,
our
you know,
problem.
language, family, relationships here that people have, a sense that they understand Britain more than they understand other countries in Europe. You know, there are all these different reasons why people want to come to this country.
But that's not a legitimate reason to claim an immigration status in the UK. And as much as, you know, one has to understand our own role in the world, our responsibility to certain people, there have to be controls on the border.
Last point on this, before we move on to something perhaps a little bit happier. I mean, you say that message is going out, that you won't get access to benefits, etc. But the law still guarantees access to certain rights, access to health, access to accommodation, etc. And part of that is because of our being members of signing up to the European Convention on Human Rights, for example. Now, where Reform are winning, saying we should withdraw from that because that means we won't have the obligation to do that anymore. And it is a source of frustration for a lot of people, especially in their communities where they don't see that there's access to work and they can't buy a house or live in hotels, etc. You can see where that frustration emerges from, can't you?
I can, and I would be very frustrated at the last government that refused to process people and they put them in hotels for years and years. You know, I think people who are stuck in those hotels are just as angry as the people who are outside the hotel shouting. You know, it's £2 million a day. That's a hell of a lot of money.
Shall we talk about the other story that is around, moving on completely to something different, is the world-first cancer test that is going to be rolled out in the NHS. It's described as a revolutionary blood test which can detect tiny fragments of tumour in the blood, in the bloodstream. And this will, it says, deliver diagnosis up to 2 weeks earlier than the usual tissue biopsy. And this sort of stuff, I mean, you always, when you hear about this, you think, I hope we can afford it in the NHS and that everybody who needs it can get it. But it is remarkable, isn't it? We do, when we, you know, if you do any of those things where you're, you know, you're doing a race for life or you're raising money, you think, where does this all go? Somewhere down the line, there is a remarkable breakthrough and you can feel somehow that we all were part of that. Because actually, when we raise money, it goes towards helping scientists make enormous breakthroughs.
Yeah, and it's what's amazing about this is that, you know, there'll be lots of technology involved in it. There might even be some AI that's involved somewhere down the line. And so there are things that are actually beneficial from things that appear to be scary technologies. But you're right, the question is going to be, if it's available on the NHS, how widespread is it going to be? Are people going to have access to those tests? It's not going to be a postcode lottery around who gets access to it. So adoption and deployment is the next big question around these new technologies.
I mean, 15,000 people with suspected lung cancer, as well as 5,000 women who are suspected of having breast cancer. This could be truly life-saving, right? Some good news.
Yeah, incredible. But, I mean, a nightmare for the NHS because sometimes it's actually a bit tricky if you live longer. You know, it's more expensive for the public purse. And so you just hope that this technology will be rolled out properly.
Yeah. Before we go in this part of the show, can we say congratulations to Susanna?
Oh, yeah.
Our lovely Susanna won an amazing award last night for outstanding achievement in journalism. She'll be also rather pleased. It was from the MHP 30 to 30 Watches for young journalists under the age of 30. But I think she won it for a different reason, which is for being an outstanding longevity and absolutely fantastic work. It's gold winners are selected for outstanding investigation, storytelling and impact. So congratulations to Susanna. No doubt she'll be here on Monday with her award, but congratulations, well deserved.